Well, welcome, buddy, to a brief talk on study designs. This is going to be a really brief introduction. And for those of you who know more about study designs, you're going to realize at various points that I'm kind of skipping over important aspects of study designs. And that is absolutely correct. I don't have time to go into everything. When I'm talking about these in class, I usually spend almost on each of these study designs, actually. So this is going to be a really brief introduction, just to largely introduce you to the study designs and the strengths and limitations of each. It's not a very big group here, and a lot of people have switched their video off, so I suspect some people are checking email and stuff. So if you have any questions as we're going, God, I just guilted Clement into turning her video back on. It's pretty good. Guilt is a great motivator as a teacher. But if you have any questions as we're going along, just the hand raising thing, I might notice or might not, but just unmute yourself and just enter whenever you want. That's totally fine. All right, so without further ado, there we go. All right, so the outline for today, I'm going to go over sort of an overview of study designs, and then we're going to talk about 4 specific types of studies. We're going to talk about randomized control trials, and then cohort studies, and then cross-sectional studies, and then case control studies. All right, so good study design is crucial. You've got a hypothesis that you want to answer. Everybody in this group is developing a study now and trying to design a study to answer some hypothesis. And you be very conscientious and careful about what your study design is to make sure you can actually answer that hypothesis. I mean, that seems obvious, but I've actually seen a whole bunch of studies that have been proposed and some that have even been funded that had any chance of answering the hypothesis that they proposed. It's actually not that uncommon now that I'm thinking of it. I've seen studies funded that basically have a total sample of 6. I've seen studies get funded that never actually had the possibility of even measuring the thing that they said they were going to measure. So it's important to think about this up front. You can make mistakes in study design and sometimes adjust for later on analytically. That's actually a lot of what my career has focused on, is how to fix errors that have been made in study design. But it's not really ideal. Like, that's something that you don't want to have to do. You can do it, there are ways to do it, but you don't want to do it. It's much better to just design a study correctly up front. And take your time with this part. This is actually the innovative and fun part. I really enjoy designing studies. Talk about some aspects of that I think are particularly fun down the road. But inventive study designs are really great. I've seen study sections get super, super excited about a study, even if the hypothesis isn't maybe the most compelling one in the world. But if you have a really intriguing way of answering that hypothesis, you get points for that. You need to think through your steps of implementing your study. Can you test your hypothesis? And then who's going to be eligible for the study? Practical things, like how are you going to recruit people to your study? How will you define the exposure and the outcome? How will you follow people over time? How will you retain people in your study? So for each of the study designs we're going to go, I'm going to give you an example of each study. I'm going to go through a general definition of that study design. I'm going to highlight some areas of careful consideration and go through strengths and weakness of the study design. We're going to start off with randomized trials because randomized trials get held up as the gold standard in biomedical research. I don't think that's actually a great thing for biomedical research to think of randomized controlled trials as the gold standard, and go through that in a little bit. But we are going to start there because I think you can make the case that every study design we talk about could have been a randomized controlled trial in some way. So to talk about randomized controlled trials, let's think about the ideal study design. Let's say we've got a population of people and we force them to take some treatment. I'm not going to assign them to take a treatment. I'm going to actually force them to take a treatment. So there's a pill and I want to know what the effect of the pill is. I'm going to make sure that everybody takes that pill. I follow them all up over time, and I'm going to see how many of them get the outcome I care about. And then I'm going to hop in a time machine. I'm going to take that same group of people back, and I'm going to force them not to take that pill. And then I'm going to follow them forward in time again and see how often they get the outcome if they didn't take the pill. And then I'm going to compare the outcome frequency up here to the outcome frequency down here. What's the risk of the outcome if I force you to take the pill, and what's the risk of the outcome if I didn't force you to take the pill? The unfortunate thing about this ideal study design is that we are lacking in a time machine. So instead, what we do is rely on randomized control trials, where we take, we take a population, we randomly split it into two groups. One group is assigned to take the treatment, and we follow them forward, and the other group is assigned not to take the treatment, and we follow them forward. So what this does for us is that it balances important characteristics between these two groups. Like, let's say being male or being older, you're more likely to have outcome. If we have a group of people and 20% are male, 30% are older, and we randomly assign them to the two groups, we would expect that each of these two groups are going to be 20% male and 30% older. It's a way of controlling for confounding, at least in expectation. The other thing to note, we lack a time machine. We also are generally going to lack a way of forcing study participants to do the thing that we want to do. We can tell people what to do, but it's relatively rare that we can actually force them to do what we want them to do. It would be unethical in a lot of situations to force them to do what we want them to do. There are exceptions to that, like you can put fluoride in the water, and they did this as randomized trials to see how it prevented dental caries back in the day. And so it was water, which is getting pretty close to forcing everybody to take your treatment. But in general, that's not going to be the case. In general, you're going to tell somebody what to do, and they may or may not do it. So let's talk about an example. An example of a randomized control trial that is actually going on through iReach right now is the NAD randomized control trial. It is aimed at reducing the risk of alcohol-exposed pregnancies. So it enrolled 350 women who were engaged in risky drinking or unsafe sex. So they were having unsafe sex while they were engaged in risky drinking. So if they had become pregnant, it would have been potentially an alcohol-exposed pregnancy. Women were randomized to one of two arms. The first arm, which is the intervention, was repeat motivational interviewing to try to entice women to not engage in risky drinking or to increase the prevalence of safe sex. The other arm of the trial was just standard of care. They were given some pants on the outcomes of alcohol-exposed pregnancies, but that was it. Women were followed for 6 months, and then at the end of the 6 months, another survey was administered, or will be administered to the women because this is ongoing, and asked about risky drinking and contraceptive practice at follow-up. And then at the end of follow-up, we'll compare the prevalence of risky drinking and unsafe sex at 6 months in these two arms to see if this intervention of motivational interviewing has any impact. So why might you want to conduct a randomized control trial? Well, the big one that everybody talks about is that in expectation, treated and untreated groups will be the same with respect to possible risk factors. So this is what I was talking about with age and sex a few slides ago. If 20%, I guess I have 25% of the participants are men, you'd expect 25% of each treatment group to be men. That's great. It balances the confounders on average between the treatment groups, so you won't have confounding. The thing about this is that it only works in theory. Like, it works if you have an infinite number of people in your trial, then everything will be, all the confounding balanced perfectly between the two groups. We don't actually get to enroll an infinite number of people. I work on a lot of randomized trials where we are lucky to enroll 25 people maybe. And 25 people, I don't actually have any real expectation that the randomized trial is going to balance those confounders between the two arms. You still need to worry about confounding in a randomized trial. If you've got a larger randomized trial, like a few hundred people or a few thousand people, then yeah, you're probably reasonably safe. All the things that you worry about as being confounders are probably approximately balanced between the two arms, and you can also check for that to see if it is the case. But at the end of the day, if you're doing a randomized trial, you still need to worry about the confounders, especially if it's a small randomized trial, and you still need to look to see if they're balanced between the two groups, and if they're not, generally people will adjust for them. So if you're going to conduct a randomized trial, you've got three big general steps. You identify an eligible population, you randomize, and you follow them up. Defining the eligible population is actually going to turn out to be more difficult than you might at first think, because nothing in life is very easy. Your initial assumption might be that you want to define as narrow an eligibility criteria as possible when you're enrolling people in your trial. And this makes a lot of sense. It can reduce variability. I designed a trial one time that was going to be so much fun, and it didn't actually get, we never even submitted it because of interpersonal difficulties between a bunch of big babies. But we had incredibly narrow eligibility criteria where we were going to take men and women between the age of like 25 and 35 who had a BMI in a really, really small range. And the reason for doing that was because we could only get about 25 people anyhow, because this was going to be an incredibly expensive trial. So we couldn't really enroll very many people to begin with. So we made our eligibility criteria really narrow because we wanted to reduce all of the possible variability that we could think of. We were looking at BMI changes over time. And so we were trying to get as narrow a range of baseline BMIs as possible. And by doing that, we were essentially increasing the power of our study. Unfortunately, the downside of doing that is that if the eligibility criteria are really, really narrow, it makes it really difficult to generalize to other populations. Sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that's problematic. In the example I was talking about, we were very interested in a super specific biologic hypothesis about whether eating a certain diet increases body fat. And it was a very, very specific biologic hypothesis, and we weren't overly concerned about generalizability. In a lot of studies, generalizability is going to be really, really important. For instance, the Native Choices project that I talked about with alcohol-exposed pregnancies, generalizability is actually really important in that trial. Like, it would be fine to demonstrate that the intervention works in a really select population, but at the end of the day, we want to ship it to a larger group of people. And in that case, we want to be able to generalize to that larger group of people. And if we had only taken 25-year-old women with an income of $40,000 a year, it would be really hard for us to make the case that tribal organizations should try expanding this motivational interviewing program, because we don't know how any other group. All right, second step is that you're gonna have to randomize people. And it seems like this would be really easy. It seems to be you could just flip a coin and have it work out. But randomization is actually harder than you would think, and getting it right is really crucial. This is the place where you want to just hire a statistician. Schools of statistics turn out a slew of master's students each year who can randomize until the cows come home. So just let somebody who has a lot of professional experience randomizing do the randomization, and your life is going to be a lot easier at the end of the day. Another issue with randomized trials is blinding. You'll often hear people talk about single blind, double blind, sometimes even triple blind trials. So oftentimes single blinding is referred to the investigator of the trial as not knowing whether individual participants are in arm A or arm B. And it turns out that this is actually really important. There's lots of historical examples of studies that have not been blinded where investigators have very unintentionally made decisions in the course of the study that influenced the results towards one arm or the other. Ideally, the individual should not know which arm they're in as well. this would be double blind if you can make this happen. Sometimes it's possible, like sometimes you are going to give people a pill and you can just give them a pill that has the actual medicine or a pill that has sugar in it, and they'll know the difference. Other times, and you can actually carry that placebo concept fairly far. Like I've even heard of people doing sham surgeries on people. So the intervention is an actual surgery and the placebo is that you cut somebody open and then stitch them right back up without actually doing a surgery. Other times it's going to be absolutely impossible to blind the individual. So with the Native Choices Project, an individual is obviously going to know if they're getting motivational interviewing or not. No way to actually blind the individual. The third type of blinding, which would be triply blind, is if you can actually have the analyst also be blind to which people are in which arm as well. So at the end of the day, your analyst is going to analyze the data, and you could give them data that just says the exposure is 1 or 0, and they don't know if 1 means that they were in the intervention or if 1 means they were in the placebo group. And again, just like the investigator can make very small subconscious decisions to influence results, the analyst can make small subconscious decisions to influence the results. And having an analyst who is blinded is actually a pretty good idea. All right, strengths and limitations of randomized trials. So the strength is that randomization is a wonderful way to avoid confounding. I sort of suspect that in a lot of research, confounding is not quite as important as we actually think it is. We spend a huge amount of time worrying about it. I spend months and months talking to students about confounding, how to avoid confounding, and the implications of confounding, and how to control for confounding. But I also think in a lot of studies, it's actually hugely important. And when it is hugely important, we can often measure the things that we think are confounders and adjust for them analytically. Instead, one of the big strengths of randomized trials is that you get a bunch of money to study one specific hypothesis, and it makes investigators focus on those hypotheses. And you have to standardize the treatment that you give people. So if you're interested in the effect of, say, caffeine on heart attacks, you have to be really clear about what you mean by caffeine. Does caffeine mean 5 milligrams of caffeine a day? Does it mean 10 milligrams a day? And how are you ingesting it? You're ingesting it in a pill or in coffee or in tea. You've got to be really, really careful about what you mean about your treatment. And a lot of other biomedical research is not careful about how they define their treatment. And so in that sense, measurement is often better in a randomized trial than in an observational trial. And that doesn't have to be the case. There are observational studies that have fantastic measurement. But by and large, I think one of the strengths of a randomized trial is that you are getting a lot of money to focus on one hypothesis. All your eggs are in a basket. You pay really a close attention to that basket. Weaknesses that we talked about, generalizability, big one. Oftentimes, randomized trials are done in super specific, specialized clinical populations. I don't need to go into more detail about that. Really, expense. Randomized trials are expensive to pull off. You know, you're gonna ask one question, you're gonna answer one, maybe 2 or 3 questions, and you're asking for $5 million to do that. It's a lot of money. Ethics. Sometimes randomized controlled trials are not ethical. If you want to know what the effect of smoking is on throat cancer, you can't randomize people to smoke. So there are going to be some studies that are just off the board. We cannot do them ethically. And another weakness is adherence. You may randomize people to take some drug or to be in some intervention group, but they may not take that drug. You still have to treat them as being in the intervention arm, even if they never show up. So we might randomize somebody to motivational interviewing. They never show up for motivational interviewing. They're still in our treatment group as far as we're concerned. If we analyze only the treatment that people actually get, then we have an observational trial. We've thrown the randomization out the window at that point, and we could have confounding again. So even though you can randomize people to something, they may not adhere to it. This is a weakness in the sense that you would like to know what would happen if everybody did what you said. On the other hand, you can also make the case that this makes the results of a randomized trial more generalizable. If you are a clinician and you tell somebody to take a pill, not everyone actually takes that pill. And so in that sense, randomized trials might be mimicking real life in a way. All right, before I move on to cohort studies, I'm gonna check the time and see if I'm talking too long. Does anybody have questions? All right, and let me keep going here with cohort studies. So cohort studies, not sure why that keeps happening. Cohort studies are just like randomized trials. They're exactly the same thing, except that you didn't actually randomize anybody. You have two groups of people. You have people who chose to search, and you have people who chose not to take some sort of treatment. And by treatment, very general here. It might be people who exercise a lot versus don't exercise a lot. People who eat a high-fat diet versus people who don't eat a high-fat diet. People who opt to go in for motivational interviewing versus people who opt not to go in for motivational interviewing. The key concept here is that you're not randoming anybody. Everybody just does what they want to do for various reasons. You then follow them up over time and you measure the outcome frequency. What proportion of the people who treatment have the disease? What proportion of the people who did not get the treatment have the disease? And you compare those people. Was there a question? Or did somebody just unmute themselves accidentally? All right. There we go. So a couple of examples of cohort studies. There's a big study at various institutes around the country. I think University of North Carolina might be the prime site. It's referred to as the ERIC study, which stands for Atherosclerosis Risk in Community Study. This study has been going for probably 25 to 30 years. They enrolled 4,000 individuals between the age of 45 and 64. And they give them surveys every 5 years. The surveys ask about things like diet, exercise, other cardiovascular risk factors. And they ask the participants to come in every 5 years, monitor them for cardiovascular disease. So they will start putting them in MRI machines. They will go through medical records to see if heart attacks. And the idea here is that they want to look at what the effect is of, say, diet, exercise, and various other risk factors on cardiovascular disease. This study's been going on for 20 to 20 years. It's going to keep going on for a number of years. And they, unlike a randomized control trial, which generally will just have one or two primary hypotheses that they want to address, the ERIC study has published 1,000, 2,000 papers over its lifetime. It's addressed an enormous number of hypotheses while it's been going on. 2,000 is probably a gross underestimate, actually. There's a colleague of mine down the hall here who works on the ERIC study who has over 1,000 papers alone on the ERIC study. So I suspect there's 4,000 or 5,000 papers that have come out of this study. Another example of cohort studies would be medical claims cohorts. So this is an example where the data actually exists through medical claims. The investigators don't have to go out and collect their own data. They can go into medical records and, for example, look at the association between anti-clotting drugs and venous thromboembolism. You could collect a cohort of individuals based on medical claims for a 10-year period and look and see if people are prescribed one medicine versus another medicine. Often do they have various events like VTEs or bleeding. Cohort studies, again, are exactly like RCTs, but without the randomization. This has the benefit of making them a little bit easier because you don't have to actually go through the proper random people, but it has the downside of you aren't balancing confounders between the two study groups anymore. So now you actually really need to be worried about confounding. But the process of designing a cohort study is a lot like the process of designing an RCT. You define an eligible cohort, you figure out how you're going to measure the exposure or the treatment, and then you follow them forward in time for the outcome. You have to define your exposure carefully and specifically, just like an RCT. Observational studies historically have a tendency not to actually do this. Again, the example I gave before, I think, was caffeine and heart attacks. Another good one is, a really good one is actually, let's take BMI in heart. There have been a huge number of studies looking at the impact of BMI on heart disease. And in these observational studies, what they generally do is they take people who have higher BMIs and compare them to people who have lower BMIs. It's interesting to compare to, say, a randomized control trial. If you were conducting a randomized control trial and you cared about the effect of BMI on heart disease, you would have to figure out how to assign people to different BMI categories. And that becomes really weird and hard to think about. Are you going to force people to exercise all the time to keep their weight down? Are you going to force feed people a bunch of just a terrible diet? Sorry, I'm in my office today and somebody just walked outside my door, which is the first time that's happened in like 16 months. Are you going to force people to have a really bad diet to put on weight? All of these things have implications for what the effect of your intervention on the outcome is. In randomized trials, you have to be really explicit about that. Are we talking about bariatric surgery? Are we talking about some other weight loss mechanism? Because each of those has its own effect on heart disease. Observational trials have a tendency not to be as specific, which is to their detriment. They could be more specific, but oftentimes people aren't, and they should be. Additionally, again, randomized trials can, in theory, in large samples, take care of confounding. Observational studies, you have to worry about why people are getting the treatment or are exposed versus not exposed or not getting the treatment. If there's some pill out there that prevents venous thromboembolism, you need to worry about why people are taking one pill versus the other pill. It's probably because they were assigned that pill. If you're thinking about BMI, you need to worry about why people are heavier versus not quite so heavy. Things like exercise and diet are going to play a really important role here. So these are things that we refer to as confounders. And confounding is basically just a mixing of effects. You can't disentangle the treatment that you care about versus all these other factors. Like you may actually care about the effect of eating a healthy diet on CVD, but you can't disentangle that from things like smoking and exercise. They're all intertwined. It's the whole principle that correlation isn't causation. In a cohort study, you can disentangle these. It's just that in a randomized trial, you don't have to worry so much about disentangling them. In a cohort study, you have to now measure these factors in order to disentangle them. So if you're thinking about the effect of a healthy diet on CVD, you might worry about smoke and exercise because they're both related to eating a healthy diet and they're both related to CVD. We would consider them confounders. So if you're designing a cohort study, you're going to have to measure how often people smoke and what kind of exercise they get and how often they get that exercise in order to actually figure out what the effect of diet on CVD is. Strengths and limitations of cohort studies. The strengths are that it's oftentimes cheaper than an RCT. It may be more ethical than an RCT. You're going to have some exposures that you can't actually ethically randomize, but you can observe whether or not people partake in those exposures. So, if you're studying the effect of pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, and you about whether the effect of that therapy is different for people who use illicit drugs versus don't use illicit drugs. That's actually a really important thing to know, but you can't ethically tell people to use illicit drugs. You're not going to get that past the IRB, that you're going to enroll a bunch of people in your trial and you're going to give half of them morphine. That's probably not going to fly. So your only option is to actually observe people who report doing that and see what happens to them. Okay, so cohort studies may be the effect of the intervention you actually care about. They may be more generalizable. You can also easily study multiple exposures and multiple outcomes. So I was talking about the ERIC study. They've looked at thousands of different exposure disease associations. Typically with a randomized control trial, because you are focused on one or two main hypotheses, you will find that a lot of RCTs really are looking at just 1 or 2 exposure outcome relationships. You won't see an RCT publishes 1,000 papers. Weaknesses of cohort studies, confounding becomes a major issue. You really start worrying about confounding. You have to think very carefully and thoughtfully about all the different factors that affect your exposure and affect the outcome, and make sure that you're measuring them really well so that you can adjust for them analytically. Measurement error is a concern in cohort studies. It's also a concern in randomized trials, but oftentimes randomized trials, like I was saying earlier, they pour all their money into one exposure disease association. So they measure the exposure, they measure the disease as well as humanly possible. Cohort studies take the same amount of money and split it up between 15 or 20 exposures and 15 or 20 different outcomes. So they usually have to sacrifice. They might not measure all of the exposures quite as well. They might not measure all the outcomes quite as well. You might end up getting a surrogate outcome, which isn't actually the outcome you care about, but it's close to it, and maybe it's good enough. You have to worry about loss to follow-up in a cohort study, just like you do in a randomized controlled trial. Again, randomized controlled trials oftentimes have more resources to pour into preventing loss to follow-up and are often conducted over a shorter time period than observational trials. So loss to follow-up might not be quite as big a deal with some randomized controlled trials. For instance, some of the large cohort studies that I've been working on that have gone on for 15 or 20 years, they may only have 25 to 50% of their initial population left after 20 to 25 years. The rest have just been lost to follow-up over time. Finally, cohort studies are not very well suited for rare outcomes. If you're thinking about an outcome that only occurs maybe in 1 out of every 10,000 people, you're going to need a huge cohort in order to actually study that outcome. It would have to be massive. And we'll talk about a study design that will get around that later on. All right, so let's switch to cross-sectional studies. Cross-sectional studies look at people at one slice in time. So each of these arrows here is meant to be a person that's followed forward over time. And we've got 15 or 20 people. Are they trying to say something, or was it another, somebody just came off mute for a second? Okay. So each of these arrows is somebody followed forward through time. And what we're going to do is at a point in time, we're going to measure the outcome and we're going to measure the exposure. We're going to conduct a survey. We're just going to go out. We're going to give this survey to everybody on July 17th, 2021, and see how many people have exposure and how many people have the outcome. It's referred to cross-sectional survey because it's just a cross-section in time. As an example, there's a project that's done on and off for years called Project EAT. It's a study of eating, exercise, and health among teens in Minneapolis. And the way the study was conducted at baseline was a group of people went into schools and administered a survey to students in particular classes on a certain day. Every student who was in that class on that day got asked a series of questions about they exercise, what drugs they do, what their current health is like, how much they weigh, all these sorts of questions. And then we would look at the association between, for instance, the diet that somebody's eating and their BMI on that day. So the idea is that we only collect information on one specific day. You look at people at one moment in time. You interview people on a given day. Your exposure, again, might be they're eating for the last couple of weeks. Their outcome is their BMI on that day. What we're measuring here is their prevalence rather than their risk. So with prevalence, you look to see if the outcome is prevalent or there on that in time. So if we're looking at BMI, it's anybody who is overweight on the day where we give the survey. That's different than risk. Risk is whether something occurs over a time period. Prevalence is whether something has occurred at all at this moment. Risk is whether a group of people who don't have this factor develop this factor over a certain period of time. So let's think about heart attacks. Prevalent would be anybody who has had a heart attack in the past. So I go in and I ask somebody, have you had a heart attack in the past? You've got a prevalence of heart attacks in that population. Whereas if we're talking about risk of heart attacks, I would take a group of people who are plausibly at risk of a heart attack. I would follow them forward for a few years and see how many of them develop a heart attack. That would be your 5-year risk of a heart attack. The strength of a cross-sectional study is that it's generally a lot cheaper. You only have to see people one time. It's also generally a lot easier because you don't have to worry about following people over time. You go in, you ask them a series of questions, you say goodbye. You don't have to collect information on where they live and what their phone number is and who you should get in touch with if you can't get in touch with them. And then send them postcards every couple of years to see how they're doing and remind them that they're part of this study. Conducting an observational longitudinal study is actually hard work. A cross-sectional study is a lot easier. You grab the people at that moment in time and then they're gone. The weaknesses, though, are probably pretty easy to figure out, right? The biggest is that it's really hard to establish temporality. Like if I'm thinking about the effect of diet on BMI, well, let's say exercise on BMI is an even better one. So does having higher exercise decrease your BMI? The question is, what comes first here, right? It's a chicken and egg sort of scenario. It might be the case that people exercise a lot and then they lost weight, or it might be that people who do not weigh as much exercise more. And there's no way to disentangle that in a cross-sectional study. You see the chicken and you see the egg at the same time. You don't know which one comes first. And that's a big problem with cross-sectional studies. You also estimate prevalence, who has the disease, rather than risk, who develops the disease. So if you're, we're in the time of COVID. So let's say you're looking at who develops post-COVID syndrome, long haulers COVID. If you're talking about prevalence, it's just whoever has long hauler on that day that you interview them. Whereas risk would be a group of people who had COVID, who had not yet developed long hauler. You follow them forward to see who develops long haulers. Risk is what we generally care about in biomedical research. Prevalence is oftentimes a lot less interesting because part of what you're getting with prevalence are the people who are still around. For instance, if long haulers turns out to be fatal and you're looking at just prevalent disease, you're capturing a healthier population. So the people who have not yet died from. Confounding is, again, a problem with cross-section studies, exactly like it was with studies, no difference. Selection bias is a big problem. It's a big problem for cohort studies, and I didn't bring it up there, but I should have. So selection bias is basically the problem that the people who are in your study are somehow different in a meaningful way than the general population. So maybe people enroll in your trial. So we're doing a cross-sectional study of, let's say, vitamin D intake and COVID long hauler disease. And you do a cross-sectional study and you put out some flyers and you ask people to enroll in your study of vitamin D intake and COVID long hauler disease. And what's going to happen is that most people in the US don't actually participate in biomedical research anymore. Response rates are actually really, really low. So if you just put a flyer on a table, people are going to see it and they're going to completely ignore it. The people who are going to pay attention to it are the people who have COVID long hauler disease because they're super curious about what's going on with them. So you're going to get an overabundance of people with the disease in your sample. And people are also going to look at it and they're going to say, oh, vitamin D intake. I'm actually really interested in that because maybe I have a vitamin D deficiency, or maybe because I've heard the news that vitamin D is good for you and I've taken a whole bunch of vitamin D supplements. And so you're going to get this weird group of people in your study who are either more or less likely to take vitamin D and probably more likely to have COVID long hauler disease. And that's what we refer to as selection bias. And it's going to be a fairly big problem in this situation. The way around that is to design the enrollment into your study in such a way that people hopefully don't know what you're studying. There's still a chance you're going to get some selection bias even there, but you have people some information about why you're enrolling them in the study ethically, but you generally want to withhold that information until the last moment and not give them too much information about what you're hoping to find in the study. All right, the last bit here is case control studies. Case control studies are going to feel really different than the other studies that we've talked about. Case control studies are extremely handy and the least well understood of these four. In a case control study, what we're going to do is we're going to have some population of people. So each blue line here is a person who is followed over time. I don't necessarily have to have enumerated all these people and actually followed them over time, but what I want to be able to do is to find people who develop the disease. I'm going to call them cases. Those are the X's there at the end of the timeline. So I'm going to grab those cases, and then I'm going to take a sample of everybody else to be a control. So that seems kind of confusing. Like there's a cohort aspect to this where you've got people and you're following them through time to see if they become a case or don't become a case. But we're not actually making use of the whole cohort. We're just taking the people and enrolling them in the study if they be a case or a random sample of everybody else. And the benefit of this is that it's going to save us a ton of money. We don't actually have to follow the whole cohort. And I'll give a bunch of examples of this. So one example that I worked on, gosh, it's a number of years ago now actually, is in northern Minnesota, these big surface iron mines. So they mine taconite ore, which is sort of low iron ore. And the taconite mines have been in existence for the past 70-ish years. And probably 15 years ago, we realized that some of these taconite workers were actually getting very, very sick. And so we went in, we did a study, which was a case control study that had other aspects of it. But the only aspect that I'm going to talk about here is whether or not exposure to respiratory silica. So there's dust in the air that contains silica as a result of the mining process. And workers are supposed to wear masks, but they typically don't actually. It's interesting. I only now realize that there's a history of not wearing masks in certain groups, and for sort of the same reason. Like they were sort of tough guys living up on the Iron Range, almost all men back then. And so they would go into these, they were open pit mines, they weren't underground, and they would generally not wear a lot of protective equipment because they were tough. And so they became exposed to relatively high levels of respiratory silica. And there's been a question for a long time about whether that increases your risk of lung cancer. So the population that we were interested in was of iron ore miners, and we knew everybody who was in this population because they were all in unions, and the unions kept a really good record of who worked in the mine and for how long. So we had this cohort essentially of people that we were capable of following forward through time. So now what we needed to do is conduct a case control study. We needed to grab cases, so people who had the disease, lung cancer cases, and we were able to grab those cases because almost every state now has a lung cancer, or has a cancer registry. You can go to that cancer registry and see who develops cancer. So we went to the cancer registry and we figured out who developed lung cancer, and then we matched it to the union roles to see who had also been working in the iron mines. For our cases, we needed controls. We selected miners who were of the same age and sex who didn't develop lung cancer. So now we've got a group of people who developed lung cancer and a group of people who did not develop lung cancer. And then all we had to do was measure their exposure, which was whether they were exposed to silica. And we did that in a couple of ways, but it turns out that that there are federal guidelines that mines have to measure the amount of silica in the air, in the ambient air, a couple times every year. And all of those records are stored at OSHA, and we were able to grab those. And so now we've got a group of people who developed lung cancer, a control group who did not develop lung cancer, and we know how much silica everybody was exposed to. And we were able to compare the amount of silica people were exposed to in cases versus controls and see if cases had higher levels of silica than controls did. Case control studies are really nothing more than cohort studies with very efficient sampling. So in the case that I just went through with the iron ore miners, it would have been extraordinarily expensive for us to try to follow every single miner who had ever worked in one of these 6 taconite mines for 20 years. It would have been impossible. So instead what we did was we found everybody who was a case, and then we found controls. So essentially we were conducting a cohort study with some sampling, and it was very efficient sampling. We just sample everybody who's a case and we take a random sample of everybody else. So if you're a survey statistician, this just looks like a regular old survey sample. It's nothing special about it, but epidemiologists have tended to refer to this as a case control study. The power in a case control study is typically limited by the number of cases that you can enroll. The more cases, the more power. Let me go back to the example for 1 second and just point out that it also illustrates one of the real strengths of a case control study. If you really wanted to study the effect of respiratory silica in the lung cancer in an observational cohort study, you would have to enroll a huge number of people because lung cancer is really, really uncommon, thankfully. And it would have been extremely prohibitive for us to actually enroll a cohort that large. So a case control study was the only way we possibly could have done this. All right, strengths of the case control study, really well suited to rare outcomes. It can be much cost effective than a cohort study. It can also be a lot quicker to pull off. You don't have to necessarily wait for the outcome to occur. You know, lung cancer is a process that can take years to actually occur if you're exposed to something that causes lung cancer. So that's a long time to wait. With a case control study, you don't have to wait that long. You just have to find the people who have already developed it and then look backward at their history. The weaknesses is that, well, it basically inherits all the weaknesses of a cohort study. So selection bias is potentially a problem, measurement error is potentially a problem, but it also has a few others that become a bit more likely with case control studies, and you just have to be careful to avoid them. The first is selection bias. So selection bias is we talked about already, and it's a little bit easier and more catastrophic to introduce selection bias into a case control study. The second one is recall bias, and this will happen, you'll see this a lot in like case control studies of maternal exposures. So for instance, in the past, I've looked at the effect of smoking on orofacial clefts. So orofacial clefts is pretty rare. So doing this as a cohort study would be really, really difficult. If you want to know about the effect of smoking on orofacial clefts, you're kind of stuck with a case control study. So you set up a screening system, and every time a mom gives birth to a kid with orofacial clefts, you find a control, a random sample of just some other mom who gave birth on that same day. And then you administer surveys to them and say things like, so in the first trimester of pregnancy, did you smoke? And you might radically imagine that there's a problem with that, right? Like if you just had a kid with an orofacial cleft, and then a researcher comes in and said, so did you smoke during your first trimester of pregnancy? You might be a little guilty potentially about what has happened and not quite as likely to give an honest response. And so case control studies do have this potential problem that if you're asking about the exposure after the outcome has already occurred, you run into the problem of people not necessarily giving you accurate answers. All right, so to wrap it all up, we talked about 4 study designs: RCTs, cohorts, cross-sectional, and case control studies. RCTs and cohort studies are super expensive, typically. Cross-sectional studies and case control studies can be carried off for a lot less. If you have a rare outcome, you are oftentimes not going to want to do an RCT, a cohort study, or a cross-sectional study because you would have to enroll a huge number of people to actually get enough people come to analyze the data, and you're going to be stuck with the case control study. If you want to examine multiple outcomes, case control studies are not your thing there typically. It's harder to look at multiple outcomes with a case control study because you're sampling based on the outcome. There are fancier ways that you can get around it, but I wouldn't probably choose that as my first option if I really have multiple outcomes that I was interested in looking at. On the other hand, if I'm interested in multiple exposures, randomized control trials, if you're thinking about 5 or 6 different exposure outcome scenarios, are generally not going to be what you want to think about. Most study sections are going to be thinking of randomized control trials where you're thinking of 1 or 2 different exposures. There are a few special exceptions to that rule, but in general, that's the case. Whereas cohort, cross-sectional, and case control studies, it's totally normal to look at a huge slew of exposures. Only the randomized control trial is going to get you control for confounding by design. But other errors, like error and selection bias, are possible in all 4 of these study designs. And finally, a relatively cheap way of pulling off a study is to use existing data. And cohort studies, sectional studies, and case control studies are all amenable to that. Randomized control trials, I have never, it's hard to think of a randomized control trial that could be implemented using only existing data, although it might be possible, but it's going to be pretty rare. So, life is a trade-off, and you're going to have to think about these 4 different types of studies when you're designing your study. And I find that to be a fairly enjoyable part of this. Like, what's the study design that's most efficient to the hypothesis that you're asking? The best way to get the answer. It's a chance to be really creative. Like, I remember the first study that looked at the impact of talking on a cell phone on car accidents. I remember reading that as a graduate student and being totally blown away because the control group was so clever. Like, it was in Toronto, I think, and they found everybody who had a car accident over like a 6-month period. They went to them, they asked them if they had been on the cell phone at the time of their car crash. And then for a control group, they used those same people exactly 1 week prior to see if and asked them how often they were on the cell phone exactly 1 week prior they were not in a car accident. And that sort of clever study design is one of my favorite things to see. I totally love it. And then again, but oftentimes it all comes back to cost. You're going to have a certain amount of money and accessibility to data, and that will often be a large driver. You might have existing data in medical records that is there, and it would be hugely inefficient for you to recollect that same data. So if it exists through medical records data, that might drive your choice of study design as well. I think that is it. Let me exit out of here and ask if anybody has any questions.
Well, Rich, that was